They told Major Elspeth Crane that abducting a senior enemy intelligence officer from inside occupied territory was strategically worthless, that even if she somehow succeeded, one captured officer would not change the trajectory of the war. Command said the risk of losing a deep cover agent for minimal intelligence gain made the operation unjustifiable. But in the spring of 1944, Elspeth executed the most audacious kidnapping of the Second World War, extracting SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Richter from his headquarters in occupied France, and the intelligence he provided under interrogation revealed the entire German defensive strategy for the Normandy coast, information that would save thousands of Allied lives and prove that sometimes one person in the right hands could change everything. Elspeth Crane was 31 when the Special Operations Executive gave her the code name Widow and sent her into occupied France. She was pale, thin from wartime rations. With blonde hair she kept pinned back and gray eyes that revealed nothing. She spoke French with a perfect Parisian accent, German with the precision of someone who had studied in Berlin, and moved through dangerous situations with a calmness that unnerved even experienced intelligence officers. She grew up in Edinburgh, the daughter of a Scottish father who taught classics at the university and a French mother who had fled Paris after the First World War. Their home was bilingual, intellectually rigorous, and filled with discussions about history, strategy, and human nature. Elspeth learned early that wars were won not just through military strength, but through information, deception, and understanding your enemy better than they understood themselves. Her mother, Marguerite, had worked as a nurse during the Great War and seen firsthand what poor intelligence cost in lives. She told Elspeth that soldiers died because generals made decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate information. She said that the people who gathered real intelligence, who operated behind enemy lines, who risked everything to provide accurate information, those were the ones who truly saved lives even though their names would never appear in history books. Elspeth studied languages at Edinburgh, then worked as a translator in London. When war came in 1939, she volunteered immediately. The SOE recruited her in 1942, trained her in sabotage, weapons, codes, and survival, then dropped her into occupied France in early 1943. She spent 18 months building networks, coordinating resistance operations, and gathering intelligence. She was effective, ruthless when necessary, and completely committed to destroying the Nazi occupation. If you believe these stories of extraordinary service deserve to be remembered, please subscribe. We honor those who operated in darkness so others could live in light. Elspeth's path to the SOE started with personal loss. Her younger brother Thomas had been a pilot in the RAF. He was shot down over France in 1941 during a bombing mission. He survived the crash but was captured by German forces. Elspeth received notification that he was being held as a prisoner of war. Then, 6 months later, a different notification arrived. Thomas had been executed. Not in combat, not trying to escape. He had been executed by the SS for allegedly helping French resistance fighters while imprisoned. The details were vague, but Elspeth understood what had happened. Her brother had tried to do something decent in a terrible situation, and the SS had killed him for it. The grief transformed into something cold and focused. Elspeth did not want revenge exactly. She wanted to destroy the system that had killed her brother and was killing thousands like him. She wanted to hurt the Nazi war machine in ways that mattered strategically. She approached the SOE with a proposal. She would go into France, operate under deep cover, and do whatever was necessary to disrupt German operations. The SOE was initially hesitant. Women agents faced particular dangers if captured. But Elspeth's language skills were exceptional, and her motivation was absolute. They trained her and sent her into occupied territory. For 18 months, she operated in the shadows. She coordinated sabotage operations, gathered intelligence, and helped Allied airmen escape back to Britain. She was careful, methodical, and survived situations that killed other agents. She earned a reputation within the SOE as one of their most effective operatives in France. Then she learned about Oberfuhrer Klaus Richter, and everything changed. Klaus Richter was a senior intelligence officer in the SS, responsible for counterintelligence operations in occupied France. He had successfully identified and destroyed several Allied intelligence networks, leading to dozens of arrests and executions. He was brilliant, ruthless, and personally responsible for some of the most effective German counterintelligence work in the war. Elspeth had been tracking him for months. She knew his routines, his headquarters location, his security protocols. She also knew something that Allied intelligence had recently confirmed. Richter had been directly involved in planning German defensive fortifications along the French coast in preparation for the expected Allied invasion. The intelligence was fragmentary, but it suggested Richter had access to comprehensive information about German defensive strategy. If Allied forces could capture him and extract that information, it could provide critical intelligence for the upcoming invasion. Elspeth proposed an operation to London. She would kidnap Richter from occupied France and bring him back to Britain for interrogation. The proposal was immediately rejected. The operational commander, Colonel James Whitmore, said the plan was suicidal. Richter operated from inside heavily guarded German headquarters. He traveled with security escorts. Attempting to kidnap him would require penetrating German security, subduing trained personnel, and extracting across occupied territory back to Allied lines. The probability of success was minimal, and the risk of losing Elspeth, one of their most valuable agents, was unacceptable. Elspeth argued that Richter's intelligence value justified the risk. If he truly knew German defensive plans for the coast, that information could save thousands of Allied lives during the invasion. She said she had local resistance support, a viable operational plan, and the element of surprise because no one expected such an audacious attempt. Whitmore refused authorization. He ordered Elspeth to continue her current intelligence gathering and not attempt anything related to Richter. Elspeth acknowledged the order. Then she started planning the kidnapping anyway. Elspeth understood she was making a career-ending decision. Conducting an unauthorized operation against direct orders meant court-martial if she survived. But she kept thinking about the upcoming invasion, about the thousands of soldiers who would land on French beaches facing German defenses. She thought about her brother Thomas, executed by the SS. She thought about all the young men who would die storming beaches if Allied forces did not have accurate intelligence about German defenses. She thought about what her mother had told her, that the people who gathered real intelligence were the ones who saved lives. The moral calculation was clear. She could follow orders, continue her current work, and preserve her career. Or she could violate orders, attempt something that would probably get her killed, but might provide intelligence that changed the invasion outcome. Elspeth made peace with the decision. She was already living on borrowed time in occupied France. Every day she operated behind enemy lines was a day she might be captured, tortured, and executed. If she was going to die anyway, better to die attempting something that mattered. She contacted her most trusted resistance contacts and explained what she wanted to do. They thought she was insane, but they also respected her enough to help. Over 2 months, they developed a detailed operational plan. The operation required perfect timing and ruthless execution. Elspeth identified a vulnerability in Richter's routine. Once a week, he traveled from his headquarters to a communications facility on the outskirts of town to review intercepted Allied transmissions. The journey was short, maybe 3 kilometers. But there was a section of road that passed through a wooded area where visibility was limited. That would be the location. Elspeth assembled a team of 8 resistance fighters. They would ambush Richter's vehicle, neutralize his security detail, extract Richter alive, and move him to a safe location. From there, Elspeth would arrange transport back to Allied lines using escape networks that SOE had established for downed airmen. The plan had a dozen points where everything could collapse. If Richter changed his routine, if German forces responded faster than expected, if the resistance team could not execute the ambush cleanly, if Richter was killed during the extraction, the operation would fail catastrophically. They rehearsed for 3 weeks. Every movement, every contingency. The resistance fighters were skilled but nervous. They understood this was different from their usual sabotage operations. This was directly attacking a senior German officer in broad daylight. The day of the operation arrived. Elspeth positioned the team along the wooded section of road. They had stolen German uniforms for the initial approach, planning to pose as security reinforcements to get close before initiating the ambush. Richter's vehicle appeared exactly on schedule. 2 cars, the first carrying security personnel, the second carrying Richter and his driver. They approached the ambush position. Elspeth gave the signal. The ambush was violent and precise. The resistance fighters disabled the first vehicle with a concealed explosive that destroyed the front axle. The vehicle swerved and crashed. Before the security personnel could respond, resistance fighters in German uniforms approached, appearing to offer assistance. The second vehicle stopped. Richter's driver stepped out to assess the situation. That was the moment. Resistance fighters subdued the driver and pulled Richter from the vehicle. He fought, shouting in German, but was quickly restrained and injected with a sedative that rendered him unconscious. The entire ambush took less than 2 minutes. 3 German security personnel were killed. 1 resistance fighter was wounded, but Richter was captured alive. They moved him to a farmhouse 10 kilometers away. Elspeth kept him sedated but stable. German forces would be searching everywhere. They had hours at most before the search perimeter expanded to include their location. Elspeth contacted her SOE handlers using emergency protocols. She informed them that she had Richter in custody and needed immediate extraction. The response from London was shock followed by fury. She had violated direct orders, but now that she had Richter, they could not simply abandon the operation. A Lysander aircraft was dispatched from Britain to a covert landing strip near their location. The plane would arrive after nightfall. Elspeth needed to keep Richter alive and hidden for 8 more hours while German forces tore the countryside apart looking for him. German patrols came within a kilometer of the farmhouse twice. Each time, resistance fighters diverted them using false intelligence about sightings elsewhere. The tension was unbearable. If they were discovered, everyone would be killed. As darkness fell, they moved Richter to the landing strip. The Lysander arrived precisely on schedule, landed briefly, and took Elspeth and Richter aboard. Within minutes, they were airborne, flying back across the English Channel. Richter regained consciousness during the flight. He looked at Elspeth and asked in German who she was. She replied in perfect German that he was going to London to help the Allies win the war. Richter said nothing else. Richter was interrogated for 3 weeks by British intelligence. Initially, he refused to cooperate, but interrogators used a combination of psychological pressure and strategic deception. They showed him evidence that the war was lost, that Germany's defensive strategies were already compromised through other sources, and that his cooperation would not betray anything that was not already known. It was not entirely true, but it was effective. Richter began talking. The intelligence he provided was extraordinary. He revealed comprehensive details about German defensive positions along the Normandy coast. He identified which beaches were most heavily fortified, where reserves were positioned, how German commanders planned to respond to an invasion. He provided information about command structure, communication protocols, and defensive tactics. Allied planners used this intelligence to refine the D-Day invasion strategy. Knowing precisely where German defenses were strongest allowed them to adjust landing zones, coordinate naval bombardment more effectively, and plan for contingencies. The information did not guarantee success, but it significantly improved the probability of survival for the first waves of troops. When D-Day occurred on June 6, 1944, Allied forces faced brutal German resistance, but the invasion succeeded, partially because planners had intelligence about defensive positions that allowed them to adapt tactics. Post-war analysis suggested that Richter's intelligence saved hundreds, possibly thousands of Allied lives during the invasion. Elspeth faced consequences for violating orders. She was formally reprimanded and removed from active operations. But the success of the kidnapping and the strategic value of the intelligence made severe punishment impossible. She was quietly reassigned to training new agents, teaching them operational planning and field tactics. She never returned to France. The war ended in 1945, and Elspeth left the SOE. She returned to Edinburgh and worked as a translator, living quietly for the next 40 years. She never married. She rarely spoke about the war. Colonel Whitmore, who had refused to authorize the Richter operation, wrote her a private letter after the war. He said he had been wrong to deny authorization, that her operational judgment had been correct, and that her willingness to violate orders for strategic necessity had demonstrated real courage. Elspeth never responded to the letter. She died in 1987 at age 74. Her obituary mentioned her war service only briefly, noting she had worked for the government in intelligence roles. The classified details of Operation Widow, the code name for the Richter kidnapping, were not declassified until 2005. When historians finally examined the operation, they recognized it as one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the Second World War. A single agent had kidnapped a senior enemy officer from inside occupied territory, extracted him to Britain, and obtained intelligence that directly influenced the most important military operation of the war. Elspeth's name is now included in the SOE Memorial in London, though most visitors do not know her specific contributions. But among intelligence historians, she is remembered as the agent who understood that sometimes one person, in the right hands at the right time, could change the trajectory of a war, not through violence, not through destruction, but through the ruthless application of intelligence gathering at the moment when it mattered most. She turned the war with one kidnapping, and thousands of soldiers who survived D-Day never knew they owed their lives to a woman whose code name was Widow, and whose courage exceeded even the most optimistic assessment of what one agent could achieve behind enemy lines.